Welcome to the Water People podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Hill, and my co-host is Dave Rastovich. This season is supported by Patagonia, whose purpose-driven mission is to use business to save our home planet.
Today, we're in conversation with conservationist Andy Ridley, founder of Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef. Andy also founded the Global Earth Hour campaign, which asks everyone with electricity to simultaneously turn off their lights for 60 minutes to acknowledge the impact of climate change and our ability to influence that change. Earth Hour is recognized as one of the largest mass participation movements in history, with hundreds of millions of participants around the world. Andy's newest platform is Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef, which serves as a way to engage people all around the world in the future of the reef through citizen science.
We acknowledge the Bundjalung Nation, the first and ongoing custodians of the land and waters where we work and play, who have lived, worked, and cared for this sea country for tens of thousands of years. Respect and gratitude to all First Nations people who continue to practice the cultural, spiritual, and educational customs of their ancestors.
Davey, you recently, well, not so recently now, but you made a trip up to the Great Barrier Reef. Can you tell me about why you went and why you chose to podcast with Andy Ridley in particular?
Well, the opportunity to go to the reef is just too good to refuse. A lot of us in Australia, we're right on the doorstep of the Barrier Reef, but really a lot of us don't seem to get there for some reason, and especially surfers, it seems, just because of the lack of surf and whatnot. So I got invited to go up to the Barrier Reef a couple of years ago with a good mate, Glenn Casey, and the Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef group as part of the Great Reef Census Project, which was to map the reef because only 40% of the reef had been mapped at that stage.
That seems unbelievable.
Yeah, there's 2,300 kilometres of reef. There is so much still being discovered about the reef, about how these incredible organisms respond to marine heat waves, to radical storm and weather events, and also to pollution coming off the land all the way up to the tip of Queensland. So
agricultural runoff?
Yeah, all kinds of things. So industrial agricultural runoff and domestic runoff, stripping of land, whatnot. So we went there and it was incredible to see how engaged people were who were going out to the reef, and they would vary from commercial reef snorkeling, scuba diving operators, just private people sailing through, cruising through the area, fishers, and lots of people from university education groups who would go take a few pictures of the reef, upload it to the Citizens website, and then help to understand how this enormous area of incredible marine life is coping with these radical changes, these increasing temperature rises and weather events. So that was really special for me to see that in action, because what they were doing, they were taking something as fun and kind of silly as snorkeling and diving on the reef, and they were making it really useful and meaningful for people. We were on board the Spirit of Freedom vessel with a big group of people. There was a lady, I think she was in her late 70s, having nearly her 80th birthday on the boat, and she was going for her 1,000th scuba dive.
Wow.
And she was incredible, and you could just see how much this meant to her to be able to use her diving usefully by taking these pictures and putting them into the website, into this database, to get a clearer picture of what's happening on the reef. And that's someone who's done a lot of diving in her life. So then fast forward to just a couple of months ago, we've got another opportunity to go up to the reef and see some reef restoration work happening. And that is a great part of the Citizens Project, where in conjunction with the Yirukandji Sea Rangers and the Rangers, they're Indigenous people of that region, are working to take pieces of the reef that are somewhat heat tolerant and basically propagate them, take them and put them in places where a marine heat wave or a storm has destroyed part of the reef, and replant them essentially, and help these reef systems be more resilient, because there are some types of coral that can cope with those weather events and those heat waves. So at the center of all of that is Andy Ridley. And this guy, to me, is just such a powerhouse and such a thinker in terms of opening up these kind of projects for everyone to participate in, and also to take something as silly as snorkeling and turn it into something very, very useful. And of course, for you and I, we think of that with surfing. We think, oh, how can we make our surfing life more meaningful? And we're still yet to figure that out on a level like Andy does, but I was very impressed with that. Of course, he's got a lot of history with creating Earth Hour, a massive global movement, and also in circular economy work in Europe. And for me, I just felt like his story, his knowledge, and his ability to articulate these big feelings, these big projects, and these big ambitions is just wonderful to experience. And it was a real pleasure for me to sit with him after diving all day out on the reef. We're still sunburnt and salty and tired, but lit up. And this is the conversation we had. Like to launch in with that question and wondering, Andy, if there's a time or an experience in your life after which you were never the same that you'd be willing to share with us.
Yeah, so when you asked me that question, first thing that came to my mind was Live Aid. So I was pretty young, it was in the early 80s, but it was like, it was that moment where you could see that it was possible to connect across the whole planet. In this case, it was around music, etc. And you can pick lots of holes in what it ended up being and all that kind of stuff. But it was an amazing thing to see all these different cities connecting. This is pre-internet, etc. So it's basically by TV. And I was just like a kid, I was just watching and going, oh, so I'd been really aware of the famine that was happening in Ethiopia because it was all over the news. It had Band-Aid and all that kind of stuff in the UK. And so kind of it really entered the culture of the country and everyone was kind of talking about it. And then Live Aid happened in the summer and it was just like, oh, and then all these bands and all these people connecting and the stadium's full of people and then Bob Geldof doing his, this is all fantastic, but no one's giving any money and doing that kind of big rant. And I remember the rant, and it was that whole, and I think that kind of, for me, definitely set a course. I remember that being kind of, wow, okay, you can do something really amazing. People have a common purpose.
How old were you?
I reckon that was 1984, so I'd have been 13 or something.
Were you at the event or just watching it on TV?
No, not at all. I remember being with a couple of mates and then I remember watching bits of it at home and then listening to it on the radio in my bedroom and yeah.
And it made that much of an impact?
A massive impact. And I have many friends similar of my age who that had a big impact on.
Where were you when that was happening?
I was in England.
So you were in England?
Yeah.
And that's where it happened?
Yeah, that's where it was the Band-Aid thing, and then which was a song, and then there was Live Aid, and it kind of, I think it kicked off in London or somewhere, and then but it was Sydney and New York and LA and Berlin and all these other places.
Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that funny sometimes the way something like that can happen in formative years of your life, and in a sense, it sets up a rhythm for
it completely
things of that nature that you've been part of.
Yeah, I reckon. I mean, totally set my path. I reckon. The only other times in my life where there's been something that's gone mind changing, I guess, experiences in nature. I think they're the only other ones that really do that. But that was kind of, when you asked the question, that was what first came to my head. Yeah.
Which is an interesting one. It's when we ask that with people, it can kind of go two ways. Like sometimes people have one that jumps straight to the front of their mind, but it's a little too vulnerable or personal or just personal or private to share. And then there's the response that's kind of like vague in that, I've had lots of those moments in my life. And we've found that it's really interesting when you do get that quick response. Like when I said that to you, you said, oh yeah, I know what that would be, and the impact of that. Though what you're saying to me, that experience isn't like a life or death experience.
No.
It isn't a huge loss.
It's a realization.
Something traumatic. Yeah, it's a realization moment. And I feel like that has to have played a part in a lot of your efforts in your conservation work when you think about Earth Hour and your deep involvement, or circle economy, these shared economy ideas, and now citizens of the Great Barrier Reef, they're almost of that similar nature.
Yeah, they're really similar.
It's a realization moment for people, and just because you're not at the gig or you're not underwater on the reef, has not held you back from pursuing that idea that you could have a cathartic or a very impactful experience.
Yeah, the cool thing with Live Aid, and I often talk about it, I'm 51, so I sort of also have to realise that there's quite a lot of people. My team would say that all the time, actually, old bastard. But there's a lot of those things where
no one's sitting over there smiling behind your back right now.
Yeah.
They're working hard over
Funny
there.
That, eh? But the realization thing with the live Aid thing, that comes across again and again when we're doing stuff, I think, here with Citizens, or certainly with Earth Hour, is that you often it's the don't think you can't do it because somebody's already had a crack at it. Do you know what I mean? It's actually just giving you it gives you that kind of a dull way of putting it would be, you've got a case study of mass global engagement. That's what Live Aid was.
Yep. And
it sounds really boring when you say it like that. It's much more interesting than that.
I'm thinking of that experience and how you were saying, like, for Sir Bob Geldof now, isn't he? He's a Sir now, isn't he? He would have had probably a moment of frustration or of realising that there was something not quite working in terms of aid and people's need and the way it was. And so he and many others, I'm sure he had a big team, created Live Aid. And then I think about your efforts, say, with Earth Hour and also Citizens, where you're looking at a way of conservation that is perhaps not quite...
frustrating.
Yeah. So frustrating is it for you?
Yeah, so I think Earth Hour was born, often, as I've said this before, like Earth Hour was a bit born out of frustration. And there's a few bits of kind of things that you sort of realise, because I didn't start in conservation. I was working on, disadvantaged young kids stuff in the UK, and then came out to Australia and went up to the reef and kind of got into conservation at that point. So 2002. But the thing that the realisation around that was that we kept talking, as conservationists, we kept talking to a whole load of people who already were on board, like, the 5% are already there. And then we'd have a fight with another 5% at the other end who, like the shock jocks or whoever, and who are never going to, it's in their interest to have a fight. And we completely ignored that big bulk in the middle. And generally, in if you want change, it's the middle that needs to move. And so with Earth Hour, I was talking to you before about this. There was a parent of Earth Hour called Future Makers, and it didn't work, but we learned lots from it. And it didn't work because it was kind of under the constraints of a big conservation organisation. It was all about fundraising. It was all about the brand, and there's all these things that kind of historically are important if you're doing a campaign. It didn't have that kind of moment of the symbolic moment of togetherness, which I think is critical in anything. If anything's going to get scale, you've got to get a sense of, it could be actually a small group of people, but you've got to get that sense of kind of we're working together to do something. But on big scale, same thing. You might never meet them, but you've got to have that sense of common purpose. And so we learned you will learn a few bits and pieces in there, but the frustration around traditional conservation is it's just very big brands trying to commit an old model that's born in the 1960s into a problem that's now very 21st century that requires mass engagement and mass scale up. And therefore you've got to get rid of a lot of the boundaries that say only experts can work in this, or, give us the money and we'll deal with it. Everything's too big now. The problems are too big. You need mass engagement in conservation in parallel with mass engagement around cutting emissions.
I didn't really want to linger on Earth Hour too much. I'm sure there's lots to chat about there, but you've probably chatted about that a lot since then. But the citizens idea and just that language, even now, like I'm sitting here looking, we're in your office, your team's office in Cairns. We've just been out on the reef looking at the work that you all are a part of. I'm looking at a little banner here that has a beautiful ring of different animal species that call this part of the world home. And the first word, citizens, and the inclusivity of that is really wonderful. And I can't help but think about the language I grew up with when I was a concerned young kid wanting to participate in activism and conservation efforts. It all felt very militant. It all felt very, even the word campaign, all these words all felt very us and them. They all felt very militant, like that it was a fight. It was always a fight. It was always described as a battle. Everything was a fight. And I just didn't enjoy that as a young kid. I just thought we could do better than that. And maybe it's a finicky thing about language or whatever, and you just
I don't think it's finicky at all. I think it's exactly on the money. I mean, I think that particularly now that you cannot afford to have, a small minority in a battle against the majority. The majority needs to be moving things now. And with Earth Hour, we were always talking about the power of hope. I think you can't just rely on the power of hope now. Citizens is always about, and the word is about rights and responsibilities. It's both. It's not just about, tapping the finger and, telling people what to do. It's about taking control of your own destiny. It's about being a good citizen. It's about, having power in citizenship. All those kind of concepts around, responsibility. But with that, you have an amazing planet. That's the upside. The upside, we've been out on the reef today, and, that's a really good example of a nuanced situation on the reef. But when you're out in that wall where you can see those layers and layers of plate coral, it's just an amazing place to be. You're kind of like, the sun had been out, it would just blown your brain. But, so I mean, the whole concept of citizens is around activation of a citizen in a real way. So it's not Facebook-like, it's not petition writing, it's not us trying to grab data. It's like, how do we build a 21st century conservation operation with the citizen at its heart? And that's not easy to do. It's not really as I was saying, the traditional way of doing conservation is pass us your money and we'll go and do it. But we know that hasn't worked, and the scale required, that doesn't work, right? So that's what we're trying to do. And we built it the opposite way up from Earth Hour. So Earth Hour was built with the campaign first, and then we tried to go beyond the hour, which is actually really hard to do. But we kind of did it. We got bits and pieces working on it. With citizens, we've done it the other way. So we've built the conservation piece first, like the kind of things like Great Reef Census, where we're out doing reconnaissance across the reef, and the thing that you saw today, the co-op, the Reef Cooperative. But then the idea is to build that in a way that the citizen, wherever they are, whether they're a virtual volunteer sitting in Cape Town or Beijing, you will have a useful part to play. So that's the bit you've got to engineer as well.
The experience of going out on a boat nearly 2 years ago now as part of the census was so impactful for me, because I really have long thought about how in surfing we try and tie surfing, which is essentially play, to meaningfulness. So for years we've been trying to figure out ways for surfers to participate in coastal custodianship and looking after coast and country, but in a way that's fun and joyful and is embedded in the surfing experience. And it's a tricky line. And then when I went out on the boat and saw that people, we had a lady on the boat who was nearly 80 going for her 1,000th dive, who could stay underwater for, 20 minutes, 30 minutes longer than Case, our friend, who was not so good at hanging on to his oxygen, but they were having a great time, but they were also participating in the census. And I was just seeing, and also having a much richer experience, because we were all with very educated, very insightful, great communicators who are on the boat telling us what we're looking at and decoding the mystery of these rubble piles of dead reef and flourishing other areas of the reef. And I just loved what you were doing with that idea and the accessibility of that if you were a yachty, you could participate and you could be having a time of your life with your children and also having something meaningful. And I wanted to ask you if that was something that was on your mind when this idea was cooked up, if it was something you'd experienced before in other people's projects.
So that citizen being an active part of the effort is kind of what drives that. But, even when we're out today, you get people who've never been out on the reef before, or the first time out on that wall, for example, and you can just see the face kind of lights up. And so that you've actually got, your greatest advocate is if you can get people on the reef to see it. Because in its own right, it will change life. If you get a better sense of what's going on and understanding, and actually start to get that understanding that what you're doing is actually providing, in a small way, but providing information that helps it, in the case of census, be better managed, you become this sort of incredible advocate, and it makes you smile, and emotionally kind of charges you up. And, we were talking today, and you're talking about how when you look at all those kind of different shapes of coral, it's like just good for your eyes. It's all the shapes. So weird, isn't it? But I think that happens on census. I guess the closest experience we've had to that with Earth Hour was when all the lights went down. You could start to see just kind of everyone just gets this feeling. And I think it's really hard to kind of go, well, you do it by doing this, it's not an equation or something. But when we think about the Great Barrier Reef, it's the most famous natural icon on the planet, I think. And it has become the poster child for climate change in probably a too black and white way. A lot of people around the world think it's already gone. And, as you know, we talk about nuance, and it's very nuanced, the picture there. But the threats are just so real now. And I don't know, you got to use the nature's creation of the Great Barrier Reef to be your biggest advocate for getting people to move and change. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's probably a long-winded answer to whatever.
No, it's fantastic. It flows right into what I was hoping we could do is just paint that picture a little bit for people. So, what the size of the reef is, how little of it is mapped, how I was speaking with Katie this afternoon, and she was talking about the seagrass discovery she had out at Elusive Reef, and new things being discovered in this day and age where, if everything already exists on Facebook or whatever, but here is this marvel of the world.
It's still
so could you just paint a little bit of a picture of that for listeners?
I always have, obviously everyone knows the Great Barrier Reef is big. And then we sort of use comparisons like, it's the size of Germany or something. One of the ones I find the most kind of interesting is if you took it and put it against the west coast of America, it would go above the border with Canada to below the border with Mexico. So you're just looking at something that is massive. And 40% of the reef has never been surveyed. On an average year, you're probably looking at definitely less than 5%, probably more like less than 2% would get eyes on it. And the reef is made up of thousands of smaller reefs. So it's not one big kind of continuous ecosystem. It's like multiple small ones. Even with Great Reef Census, where we're building this sort of motley flotilla of boats that go out, which are made up of super yachts and dive boats and fishing boats and tourism vessels and all sorts, to capture these reconnaissance images across the whole of the Great Barrier Reef. We had 60 vessels this year, 64 vessels, and got to 315, and we're still scraping. That's the biggest survey probably ever done on the Great Barrier Reef, reconnaissance survey anyway, but we're still, scraping the surface of how big that is. And we found, the first year we did it, we found a shipwreck that hadn't been previously discovered up in the north. I think this year we went to 88 reefs that had never been surveyed before, and as Katie was saying, they're out on Elusive Reef, which is right on the bottom end of the Swain. So that's as far and remote as you can get really on the Great Barrier Reef. And it's like kind of the southern tip out into the Coral Sea. And then went on to Elusive Reef, very well named Elusive Reef, and found sort of different species of algae in this kind of whole ecosystem that look completely different. And so it's a wondrous place. It's an extraordinary place. You can see the damage. You can see what's going on, and you can see the threat. This year we had mass bleaching across the whole of the reef, but it's right at the end of the summer. So the weather changed. The whole team, we were all out on a reef out here called Saxon. It's a beautiful little reef. And, but on that day, we went in the water on a Thursday, and a third of it was bleached, a third of it was fluorescing, which is the stage the reef goes into, a very bright stage it goes to when it's stressed, and the rest was normal. So a third. And we all came out of the water, and it's, we know it's a beautiful place, and we're all sort of a bit depressed, to be honest, because of seeing the bleaching coming in. And you just know that unless the weather flicks, then mass bleaching with mortality can happen. So that reef can come back from there. Even at that stage, even when it's bleached, it can still recover. That Sunday, the rain came in, and the cloud came in. And so the rays from the sun minimised, the water starts to get choppy, and so that sort of takes away the edge of this mass of the temperature. And so we got away with it. But that's how brinkmanship it is now, right?
Exactly.
Brinkmanship is wrong, but on the brink it is at the moment. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I remember when we were, even today actually, when we were diving, but also the trip a couple of years ago, where what was a really impactful experience for me was the non-linear nature of it. That it's not just this idea where, the heat's coming down and it's working its way down, and
it's really not.
Everything's just getting cooked, and that's that. And our experience was the opposite, where you would see a flourishing tropical garden underwater, and then literally 50 meters away would be this really cooked spot and rubbled and everything.
Yeah, it's insane, right?
And I think that's also something interesting for people to listen to and hear. There's a lot of people listen to this overseas who would have very little insight into the nature of the barrier reef, and I think this is where that nuance and that much more intricate picture that the census is helping to create needs to happen.
Well, when we did, census was sort of designed to kind of, one of the purposes, there's three sort of reasons why we do it, but one of them is really to sort of to look at the modelling that's done by the research institutes that say, well, this reef should be in a good state. This reef will be damaged from heat, etc., right? And when we went out in the Swains, again, that big area of the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef last year, and we were looking for the areas that were meant to be kind of pretty cooked. And the modelling versus the reality was often very different.
Really?
Yeah. So I mean, this is kind of why.
Unreliably different? Like you would go, I don't know how much we're going to listen to that modelling.
There was significant. Like when the reconnaissance images were analysed and added into the mix, there was significant difference in the modelling. And this year we've got so many images this year that we're still working on the modelling, but there will be, again, it'll be the same. But you find some reefs that, like, I dived on this reef. I think it just had a number. It didn't have a name, and on Great Barrier Reef, and it was probably the most beautiful place I have ever dived in my life. It's sort of one of those places, if you'd taken acid, you wouldn't believe it. It was just so insanely beautiful. It was the morning after the spawning as well, so it looked like everyone had a big party, and it just was just vibrant and just, but it had a lot of gullies and sort of crevasses in it, so you get a lot of water flow through there. So I reckon that was probably the hydrographic kind of nature of it would have been interesting. So, yeah.
Apologies for interrupting the conversation, but we'd like to take a moment to recognize the generous folks who help make this podcast possible. Sunbutter Skincare is committed to protecting people and the planet. They make vegan, reef-safe SPF 50 sunscreen packaged in reusable and recyclable tins. They're also the world's first certified palm oil-free sunscreen brand. Check out sunbutter.com.au to learn more about their skin and ocean-friendly lines of sunscreen, surf zinc, and skincare. Thanks also to Gary McNeil Concepts, who make cosmic surfboards for cosmic people. Gaz's boards combine recycled and plant-based materials that are built to last without sacrificing performance. To learn more, head to GaryMcNeilConcepts.com.
The nuanced look, the more intricate look at the reef, I think is really interesting for people. I think if there were any insights in terms of like trajectories, or projections into the near future that you've come across through anyone from the James Cook University or even just old fishers and especially First Nations people who have a deep time perspective or anything along the lines where there's a view that looks perhaps a little forward in time. Are you hearing anything about how that forward glimpse looks to various people? Because it could be interesting, there might be similarities, there might be differences in perspectives. What are you coming across?
Yeah, okay, so sort of more of a personal answer on some of this, but I mean the projections of increased cyclones and bleaching and, certainly the bleaching is happening more and more frequently.
What are the numbers on that? So I know there was a few years ago that were like 3 in a row.
We had 2 sequential, very big, with mass mortality bleachings in 2016, 2017. And then I think we've had 3 more since then. Looking around to see how one of my crew. How many bleachings has there been since 2016? Is it 5?
2016, 2017, 2020.
Yeah.
21, 22.
I think that's 5, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, the predictions were conservative, as with most predictions on climate, to be honest. Some of the predictions around, it's all going to be, I actually think when that big one happened in 2016, I was actually working in Amsterdam and I came back to do this job. I remember the story going around the world was basically the reef was dead. So I think, for people to understand that it isn't is important, it's super important because, what's worth saving if it's not there to be saved, I guess. But the trajectory is pretty horrifying. I mean, basically this decade is it. I mean, it is not, and that doesn't mean at the end of this decade, it means like right now. I think one of the things that sort of slightly alarms me a lot around climate change stuff is we talk about 1.5 and then we talk about 2 degrees. But everything between 1.5 and 2 degrees is important. So if we could, stabilize temperatures at 1.67, that would be way better than 2 degrees, What I reckon's happened in the last 5 years is you can now definitely see in multiple different places across the planet in a really live, absolutely there it is way, the effects of climate change. You can see it increasing on a yearly basis, whether it be fires or whether it be, effects of hot water on the reef. And it's a bit terrifying. And it's basically foot down now. No more bullshit. Time to go. Time to get stuff done.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a quote of yours I came across where you were saying, you don't just need hope, you need practical action.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned that to somebody, and I really liked that. And I also made me think about outrage and frustration and anger as a starting point.
Yeah.
For these sort of efforts. And it's obvious what we've been talking about, the action. There's many choices we all have, personal and political and bigger project-based actions like with citizens. But also I'm curious about the hope bit still.
Yeah.
Because these are big weights to wear on our shoulders.
Sure.
I could see it then when you were saying that. You're like, whoa, foot to the floor,
Yeah.
It's like you got to kind of muscle up for that. But how do you maintain a lightness, or how do you maintain the ability to persevere, to continue and to keep working and to feel that hope? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think sometimes you don't, is the answer to that. Sometimes you kind of...
Which is equally great to share with people.
You fall over,
to give each other permission to feel like shit sometimes and feel overwhelmed.
And I think sometimes you're not your best person and all that kind of stuff doing this kind of jobs. But I do, I'm in some ways I'm lucky because I have seen, to bore you with Earth Hour stuff, but that first time when it happened, that was a moment, talking about Live Aid, but there was a moment with the first Earth Hour, we were standing on the side of the Botanical Gardens in Sydney, and we had no idea whether or not people were going to do it. And I'd given up smoking like 2 or 3 months before, so I was cranky as an absolute madman. And then, you start to see these lights go off, and, first it's the big logos, and then houses start going off. And I remember thinking about it being kind of one moment, and it wasn't one moment. It was like, oh, there's one. And then the bridge went off, and then the Opera House went off, and you're like, holy shit, this is, and then looking around, and then the Botanical Gardens are full of people having picnics with candles, a couple of million people in the city who've never met each other, or mostly haven't met each other, and their weird mixture of, we had priests and strippers and sports stars, and some of them were both of those things. And all these people were like connected and doing something. And so that for me is where you still get that kind of moment of going, well, I reckon the majority kind of want the change. The challenge is system change. Even in conservation, it needs change, right? So, how do you address that? But then, you see our electorate kind of stepped up a week ago. Wasn't sure that was going to happen, but, right now we want a bit of change.
Yeah. So in that, like, in sort of, I'm interested, and I like talking with you about like the arc of conservation movements and groups and sort of waves of the way conservation efforts can be expressed. And I'm interested to hear what your perspective is in terms of perhaps how the conservation world was, say, 90s, early 2000s, and perhaps is now and is changing and morphing right now. I'm interested to hear your perspective on this very dynamic moment, it feels like, where a lot of that systemic change is groaning. It's not quite there, but it's, I'm just curious to get your perspective.
So I think the big conservation operations basically mimic very large corporations and don't do it very well, right? So I think they mimic big corporations because often their boards are driven by people who've come from big corporations, and they look at corporations as a way to structure. So that makes them highly competitive, frequently aggressive in terms of, territory, and guarded. So they do tiger conservation, or they do X, whatever it is, right? And I think that has a couple of big flaws in it. The first one is if you see disruption in any kind of area, whether it be record industry, and you get, now it's all streamed, so record shops are gone, and, it's a very different world. Or if you see it in hotel industry, and you think about things like Airbnb that revolutionized, I'm not saying they're good for the environment or anything, I'm just saying they revolutionized how taxis, Uber, fill in the gap, right? In a way, with conservation, it is going through that change. I think it's beginning to go through that change now. I think it's not before time. And that, for me, is a bit like, going, okay, we have to genuinely empower every citizen, small c, not spruiking the brand, but you have to genuinely empower every citizen to be the owner of the conservation effort. In the same way that we have to do that with climate change. And they're two different things. They're super interrelated, but they're different. One is about restoration and getting things, creating the lifeboats we're going to require to get through climate change. It's about restoring the land that we've wrecked, together in the last couple of 100 years. And it's about, creating, giving nature its rightful place in the way that we live. So, but the only way you're really going to do that is if you can't hand it to essentially a corporation. It has to be driven by the people, and therefore the people have to give a shit.
Yep.
And if you've never been, and I don't mean this in a mean way, but if you've lived in London all your life, or you've lived in, I don't know, even, Sydney, and you've never been out into nature, then you're not going to be connected to nature. So that's another piece to that, is how do you help that happen?
Yep. And this brings me to the shared economy idea that I know you're really mindful of with your work right now. Can you explain that a little bit for listeners?
With this Great Reef Census project, which is the reconnaissance across the reef, that was basically, we took a lot of principles from shared economy and went, okay, we need to build $1 billion research flotilla, and we've got bugger all money. And yet there is maybe not $1 billion research flotilla, but there's a potential flotilla out there if we could utilize every asset, dive boats and super yachts and whatever else we can get our hands on. So that was it was a really simple answer to a brief. We need to get reconnaissance images from across the whole of the Great Barrier Reef. How do we do it, given that we've got almost no money? And so that's kind of how the approach, which is a shared economy approach, is a bit like, creating a massive taxi fleet out of private cars. I mean, actually not too different, except it's for good. My sense of that is if you're able to think about all conservation through that prism of like every person is an asset, every vessel, in this case, is an asset that you can use. Every camera could be an asset. What do you want to do? And so with sensors, obviously we're after photographs for the first, for the sort of, that's the primary purpose of it. But now we're starting to use that kind of motley flotilla to do all sorts of things, surveying for seagrass, which Katie was talking to you about, for sea cucumbers, seeing, keystone species, or tagging megafauna, all sorts of different things. So it's just taking it's like most of the stuff, you're just taking something that somebody else has done really well in a different sphere and just going, right, let's try that here and see if it works. Fundamentally, what you need for it to work is willingness.
And that shared economy, you think of the space that we all share here together, and you can't help but think of First Nations communities and the role of deep knowledge and understanding there.
We were talking about sort of a relative of shared economy, like circular economy. So, circular economy, definitely not a new idea, but essentially the way it's sort of talked about is most of the global economy runs in a linear sense. And so you take it, you make it, and then you break it and put it in the bin. And I think basically the stat is that around 92% of all the stuff that we dig out of the ground to make into phones or cups or tables or energy, we use it once and then we throw it into the atmosphere, into landfill or into the oceans. So completely and utterly unsustainable, especially as the population is what it is. So when you look at some of the traditional owner kind of practices, in fact, you look at most historical practices past 200 years ago, everything is thought about what's its next use. How does that fit in the cycle of the seasons? How is that what will we need that for next? And I worked on circular economy when I was in the Netherlands, which is sort of quite famous for that, for its work on that. And then you come here and you're listening to some of the stories from the First Nations people, and you're like, oh, it's totally circular economy. It's just 40,000 years ago. So, all the lessons we need are already there, right?
Yeah. I was speaking with some people recently about our response to the floods and the experiences we've had this year in our region, and our lack of understanding, intricate understanding of the ecology in our region. And I was likening it to surfing. And when you go surfing in a new place, you can do all right, but usually you kind of get dusted on the rocks when you jump off to go surfing because you don't know where to jump off in the right spot, or you fall, or you paddle in the wrong place, or you upset someone because you get in their way or whatever. Yeah. You can do all right, but generally you have a bit of a shocker. Yeah. But if you're with a local and you have local knowledge, and they help you see where you are, and they guide you through the turbulence, they guide you out to that clear space behind the waves and the noise and the chaos, and help you see and come in safely and have a great time and not upset things. That is so like where we are right now with reaching out to First Nations people who are willing, are open to share, and if we are respectful listeners, that we have an opportunity to relate to country right now in a similar way, where we need that local knowledge if we're going to be developing deep relationship.
What I found in a kind of embarrassing but kind of very good, feels good kind of way. I was telling you the story before, but basically I was with two guys from Irukandji Ranges, whose sea country is just sort of north of Cairns, Gavin and Brian, and we're having this kind of conversation around a project that we've all been working on called Kulbul, which means spirit of sea country. And one of the ideas of this is you're trying to bring together traditional owner knowledge with current know-how on reef stewardship. And those two things blend. A lot of people are working on this, so it's sort of not new. But that was the theme of this program we're working on. And one of the things we were trying to make this video around, that concept of bringing the traditional owner knowledge together with it. And I was having this conversation, and I was going, do you think we've captured that on the video? And we're just having this conversation about it. And Brian said to me, he goes, we've been working together for a year, so we're already sharing knowledge. And you're like, and you just sort of think about it, and sometimes you still think of this sort of, I don't know how to sum it up, but kind of the normal world that I live in. And then you suddenly realize, oh my God, for the last year we've been having these conversations, and the enlightenment and revelation, the fact that we're actually having a conversation and everyone's working together on this stuff. And you realize that firstly, you're extremely privileged to be allowed to be there and to have that conversation. And that sometimes you have to rethink how so much of life, especially if you're dealing with a lot of funders, so much of life is about KPIs and gateways that you have to, milestones, and that First Nation knowledge is not like that. It is not like that, and it is better for it. It comes back to this thing about conservation being treated like it's a corporation. It's not.
Yeah, it's relationship, isn't it? It's deeply
a relationship on multiple levels with lots of different people working on the reef, with nature itself, with yourself, and between not getting too, weighed down by it. Because, what's the, where does that help? Yeah, it's interesting. It's super interesting. They have a complete, and I'm ignorant to, and the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. And, then that's a kind of cool kind of feeling, actually. I quite like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm aware of the fact that there's probably lots of us who are waiting to have dinner right now after a long day out on the boat and everything. I really am stoked that we got to have this conversation. I feel like in our communities, through divers, fishers, sailors, surfers, who are listening to this, and that we have the privilege of reaching out to, it's a very insightful but also applicable conversation to be having when we think about our friends and family in Florida and the Keys and the Bahamas.
Too true, right?
And our friends and family in Indonesia scattered throughout all of the islands. Coral Triangle. All the people in the Seychelles and
Red Sea. Everywhere.
Everywhere. And that the challenges we've all been living through the last few years are so similar. Like, for example, I just spoke with friends who are in the Patagonia family in Santa Barbara, Patagonia the company, and they described their fires that went through their region over the last year or so, a bit earlier, and mudslides in exactly the same way locals here down in my area in Northern Rivers explained the experience of the floods in terms of the systemic response to these mass radical catastrophes. And then you speak with other friends in Europe and other parts of the world, and we're just echoing each other.
It's fully echoing.
We really are, aren't we?
We really are.
And so this sort of opportunity where we have an opportunity, say, down here in little old Australia at the bottom of the planet, to be able to boom out to our friends and family in different parts of the world what's working, what isn't.
And what isn't.
It's really important. So I'm really grateful that we managed to do this and to share the insights. And I really encourage people who are listening to dive deeper into the Citizens' work and the perspective that you have with this work, because of those echoed experiences that are global.
Oh, honestly, I just think that you're exactly right. It's there is so much more that we. Like, the capacity to scale up conservation is completely there because everyone's going through the same stuff. It's just a matter of building them. For me, at least, it feels like building a model is really important. Getting practical is really important, but doing that in a way where you go, even if you're doing something in Florida Keys, you go, right, when I do this, I just want to remember that somebody in Australia, Coral Triangle, whatever, fill in the gap, might want to know how this went and might want to use it. So build for everyone, don't build just for one place.
Thanks for listening with us today. If you have a spare moment, please leave us a review or consider sharing an episode with a friend. Both help us to find the very best stories from our global community of water people. This episode was edited by Ben Alexander. The podcast soundtrack was composed by Shannon Sol Carroll, with additional tunes improvised by Dave and goofy-footed legends Neil Purchase Jr. and Christian Barker.
We'll be continuing today's conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcasts.